goes there?
The Developer Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Developer Media Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Wall. You have arrived at part 2 of our homecoming episode discussing cosmic horror and the family. Jacqueline Bryk presented us with a lot of new and novel directions and inspiration for growing the relationship between cosmic horror and the family. And now it's my intent to take you back into the past to the haunted streets of Providence, Rhode Island, and show you that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because as much as this is a novel approach to cosmic horror, I would argue that it's something that the earliest writers in the genre were doing the whole time, and HPL in particular. We haven't had a good, solid Lovecraftian episode in a while. I've kind of been meandering and exploring a little bit. But it's always good to go back to your roots. And when it comes to horror, my roots are definitely in Lovecraft. And so I want to walk you through a particular piece of Lovecraftian literature and talk about this subject of cosmic horror and the family. So I've really kind of got 3 things that I want to lay on you for this episode. 3 kind of key pieces of information. And I think it's best to present them up front. The first is that the family is an ideal context for cosmic horror. It creates the opportunity for layers of description and repetition that embed the horrible turn in something that feels real, that has that verisimilitude that I'm always looking for. I didn't really have the words to express my second idea until my first interview with Jacqueline, where she introduced me to the ideas of the punk philosopher Sophie Lewis and abolition of the family unit. And this second idea has to do with the fact that the family becomes the perfect nesting place for cosmic horror once it breaks containment. Because of the way that family business remains family business, and you have this linear kind of back and forth path between older and newer generations, there is an opportunity for cosmic horror to seed itself into that unit and then fester and grow in isolation. My third idea is born out of Lovecraft's materialism. And it is that, factually speaking, when we write about cosmic horror, or when we game about cosmic horror, we are not doing anything other than talking about our own human experience in a novel way. Because ultimately, all we have is our human experience. And all we have to discuss is our human experience. We do not live in a universe of gods and monsters. We live in a universe of daily, grinding human life. And so as a result, when we write and play with notions of gods and monsters, we're really just talking about ourselves. Lovecraft knew this. And even if he didn't ascribe to notions of psychology and kind of working with his own inner turmoil, this is what he was doing when he was writing, because it's what we all do when we write and create. I'm pleased to say that with each of these ideas, I have some examples that I hope you'll enjoy listening to, as I have recorded some portions of H.P. Lovecraft's The Shunned House for your review, as well as a handful of interesting letters that a very young H.P. Lovecraft received from his grandfather. So let's start with part 1, the family as context. This first excerpt I'm going to read is about the family that built and lived in the eponymous Shunned House, the Harris family of Providence, Rhode Island. One reason I really like it from kind of a scholarly perspective is it reminds me of the anthropologist Clifford Geertz and the notion of thick description. The idea that you best understand a human cultural experience by creating layers and layers of descriptive text. You describe in detail before you analyze. And what I really enjoy about this passage, as well as other passages in other Lovecraft stories that do the same thing, is these multi-generational stories within the story, the family histories. They so thoroughly establish context in which a wider cosmic horror takes place. And I think that's essential. I think what happens here as we go through the Harris family story, we are seeing Lovecraft world build. We are seeing a layer upon layer design of the past leading into the present. And I think that is vital for good storytelling. I think that it is something that, definitely is needed in literature. And I think it benefits us at the gaming table as well. I think having these deep descriptions, they don't necessarily have to be info dumps, but what they can be is kind of layer upon layer of history about your setting and about the context in which your horror is seated that helps your players feel that the environment their characters are inhabiting is real. It's as real as the real world that we wake up in every day. The history of the house, opening amidst a maze of dates, revealed no trace of the sinister, either about its construction or about the prosperous and honorable family who built it. Yet from the first, a taint of calamity, soon increased by boding significance, was apparent. My uncle's carefully compiled record began with the building of the structure in 1763 and followed the theme with an unusual amount of detail. The Shunned House, it seems, was first inhabited by William Harris and his wife Roby Dexter, with their children Elkanah, born in 1755, Abigail, born in 1757, William Jr., born in 1759, and Ruth, born in 1761. Harris was a substantial merchant and seaman in the West India trade, connected with the firm of Obadiah Brown and his nephews. After Brown's death in 1761, a new firm of Nicholas Brown and Company made him master of the brig Prudence, Providence-built, of 120 tons, thus enabling him to erect the new homestead he had desired ever since his marriage. The site he had chosen, a recently straightened part of the new and fashionable back street, which ran along the side of the hill above crowded Cheapside, was all that could be wished, and the building did justice to the location. It was the best that moderate means could afford, and Harris hastened to move in before the birth of a fifth child, which the family expected. That child, a boy, came in December, but was stillborn, nor was any child to be born alive in that house for a century and a half. The next April, sickness occurred among the children, and Abigail and Ruth died before the month was over. Dr. Job Ives diagnosed the trouble as some infantile fever, though others declared it was more of a mere wasting away or decline. It seemed in any event to be contagious, for Hannah Bowen, one of the two servants, died of it in the following June. Eli Liddison, the other servant, constantly complained of weakness, and would have returned to his father's farm in Rehoboth, but for a sudden attachment to Meadabel Pierce, who was hired to succeed Hannah. He died the next year, a sad year indeed, since it marked the death of William Harris himself, enfeebled as he was by the climate of Martinique, where his occupation had kept him for considerable periods during the preceding decade. The widowed Roby Harris never recovered from the shock of her husband's death, and the passing of her firstborn Elkanah 2 years later was the final blow to her reason. In 1768, she fell victim to a mild form of insanity, and was thereafter confined to the upper part of the house, her elder maiden sister, Mercy Dexter, having moved in to take charge of the family. Mercy was a plain, raw-boned woman of great strength, but her health visibly declined from the time of her advent. She was greatly devoted to her unfortunate sister, and had an especial affection for her only surviving nephew William, who from a sturdy infant had become a sickly, spindling lad. In this year the servant Meadabel died, and the other servant, Preserved Smith, left without coherent explanation, or at least with some wild tales and a complaint that he disliked the smell of the place. For a time Mercy could secure no more help, since the 7 deaths and case of madness, all occurring within 5 years' space, had begun to set in motion the body of fireside rumor which later became so bizarre. Ultimately, however, she obtained new servants from out of town. Anne White, a morose woman from that part of North Kingstown, now set off as the township of Exeter, and a capable Boston man named Zenas Lowe. It was Anne White who first gave definite shape to the sinister idle talk. Mercy should have known better than to hire anyone from the Noose Neck Hill country, for that remote bit of backwoods was then, as now, a seat of most uncomfortable superstitions. As lately as 1892, an Exeter community exhumed a dead body and ceremoniously burnt its heart in order to prevent certain alleged visitations injurious to the public health and peace. And one may imagine the point of view of the same section in 1768. Anne's tongue was perniciously active, and within a few months Mercy discharged her, filling her place with a faithful and amiable Amazon from Newport, Maria Robbins. Meanwhile, poor Roby Harris, in her madness, gave voice to dreams and imaginings of the most hideous sort. At times her screams became insupportable, and for long periods she would utter shrieking horrors which necessitated her son's temporary residence with his cousin, Peleg Harris, in Presbyterian Lane, near the new college building. The boy would seem to improve after these visits, and had Mercy been as wise as she was well-meaning, she would have let him live permanently with Peleg. Just what Mrs. Harris cried out in her fits of violence tradition hesitates to say, or rather presents such extravagant accounts that they nullify themselves through sheer absurdity. Certainly it sounds absurd to hear that a woman educated only in the rudiments of French often shouted for hours in a coarse and idiomatic form of that language, or that the same person, alone and guarded, complained wildly of a staring thing which bit and chewed at her. In 1772, the servant Zenas died, and when Mrs. Harris heard of it, she laughed with a shocking delight utterly foreign to her. The next year she herself died, and was laid to rest in the North Burial Ground beside her husband. Upon the outbreak of trouble with Great Britain in 1775, William Harris, despite his scant 16 years and feeble constitution, managed to enlist in the Army of Observation under General Greene, and from that time on enjoyed a steady rise in health and prestige. In 1780, as a captain in the Rhode Island forces in New Jersey under Colonel Angel, he met and married Phoebe Hetfield of Elizabethtown, whom he brought to Providence upon his honorable discharge in the following year. The young soldier's return was not a thing of unmitigated happiness. The house, it is true, was still in good condition, and the street had been widened and changed in name from Back Street to Benefit Street. But Mercy Dexter's once robust frame had undergone a sad and curious decay, so that she was now a stooped and pathetic figure, with hollow voice and disconcerting pallor, qualities shared to a single degree by the one remaining servant, Maria. In the autumn of 1782, Phoebe Harris gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and on the 15th of the next May, Mercy Dexter took leave of a useful, austere, and virtuous life. William Harris, at last thoroughly convinced of the radical unhealthful nature of his abode, now took steps toward quitting it and closing it forever. Securing temporary quarters for himself and his wife at the newly opened Golden Ball Inn, he arranged for the building of a new and finer house in Westminster Street, in the growing part of the town across the Great Bridge. There, in 1785, his son Duty was born, and there the family dwelt till the encroachments of commerce drove them back across the river and over the hill to Angel Street, in the newer East Side residence district, where the late Archer Harris built his sumptuous but hideous French-roofed mansion in 1876. William and Phoebe both succumbed to the yellow fever epidemic of 1797, but Duty was brought up by his cousin Rathbone Harris, Peleg's son. Rathbone was a practical man and rented the Benefit Street house despite William's wish to keep it vacant. He considered it an obligation to his ward to make the most of all the boy's property, nor did he concern himself with the deaths and illnesses which caused so many changes of tenants, or the steadily growing aversion with which the house was generally regarded. It is likely that he only felt vexation when, in 1804, the town council ordered him to fumigate the place with sulfur, tar, and gum camphor, on account of the much-discussed deaths of 4 persons, presumably caused by the then diminishing fever epidemic. They said the place had a febrile smell. Duty himself thought little of the house, for he grew up to be a privateersman, and served with distinction on the Vigilant under Captain Cahoon in the War of 1812. He returned unharmed, married in 1814, and became a father on that memorable night of September 23, 1815, when a great gale drove the waters of the bay over half the town, and floated a tall sloop well up Westminster Street, so that its masts almost tapped the Harris windows, in symbolic affirmation that the new boy, Welcome, was a seaman's son. Welcome did not survive his father, but lived to perish gloriously at Fredericksburg in 1862. Neither he nor his son Archer knew of the Shunned House as other than a nuisance almost impossible to rent, perhaps on account of the mustiness and sickly odor of unkempt old age. Indeed, it was never rented after a series of deaths culminating in 1861, which the excitement of the war tended to throw into obscurity. Carrington Harris, last of the male line, knew it only as a deserted and somewhat picturesque center of legend until I told him my experience. He had meant to tear it down and build an apartment house on the site, but after my account decided to let it stand, install plumbing, and rent it. Nor has he yet had any difficulty obtaining tenants. The horror has gone. If I'm looking at this passage as a gamer, I can already see that there's a lot to explore. One thing that sticks out to me right away is you have a very iconic horror trope in that you have Roby Harris, the mad woman who is shut up inside the house's attic. And, we see that trope repeated in all sorts of ways. Immediately I'm thinking of Robert Bloch's Psycho, for example. The idea of the crazy woman who is isolated and is part of the family, but is also a source of family shame. The family has to take care of this individual because they are duty-bound to do so. That is part of being family members, is that you endure one another even if you can't necessarily relate to one another, because family provides this hierarchical obligation to look after each other's needs, even if somebody is particularly toxic or dangerous or something like that. A family is a way that you can have danger in your midst. There's no saying that you couldn't have a Roby Harris type character who maybe just doesn't rant in French, but perhaps someone who occasionally is possessed by some sort of alien monstrosity, leading her to lash out at people, bite people, and the like. become a physical threat. You can wander in and find grandma, crawling across the ceiling one day, that sort of thing, and you just have to look after her and love her all the same because she's grandma. How are you not going to take care of grandma? What sort of awful person are you if you don't want to take care of your family members, even if they are monsters? The second thing that intrigues me from a gaming perspective regarding this family tree of the Harrises is that you're not just talking about the family members proper, you are talking about attachments and associations that they have. And in this case, because we're talking about a historical family with some wealth, there are some servants that are present. And these servants end up having lives of their own. They end up having attachments to each other and family members. With these kinds of figures, you can also get differing opinions. On the one hand, you can have people who are firmly attached to the family and cleave to them and show all sorts of devotion and respect and are essentially just kind of like family members themselves. Or you can have people like Mercy Dexter who ultimately leave the family. They leave service, and as a result, they start spreading gossip. And so there's layers that you can add to that. You can get different versions of the same story from a particularly devoted servant to someone who is showing monstrous affectations like Roby Harris. Or you can get a different kind of story from someone like Mercy who might see Roby's monstrousness and say, hey, that's not right. That's a really messed up thing that's happening there. And with these conflicting stories, there's opportunities to investigate in all different directions. Finally, one particular thing about kind of a mercantile family like this, and you can definitely see examples of it in future works as well. The business can get caught up in the storyline. So when we talk about various Harrises being ship captains or being members of shipping conglomerates, you can get the same sort of layering that you might see in a soap opera like Dallas with the whole kind of J.R. Ewing thing. And the greed kind of comes in as a potential angle, a potential way that you can have association, or a potential way that you can have conflict within the family. Money always makes things strange, and relationships to money are easily one thing that can outstrip the kind of relationships that family members have to one another. Anytime you involve a family with money, you're going to have drama and you're going to have conflict. So that's the Harris family. Now let's look at the other family that plays a role in the Shunned House story, the Roulet family. This is a shorter passage, but I think it's no less important in that it establishes what I talked about as my second kind of framing device or idea. The notion that cosmic horror needs somewhere to fester and breed once it breaks containment. It has to seed itself somewhere, and it has to be nurtured somehow. And the Roulet family presents a perfect opportunity for festering and breeding, as they seem to have difficulties within their own household, as well as they are outsiders to the community. They are constantly feeling put upon by the barriers that the community sets up for them. The Roulets, it seemed, had come in 1696 from East Greenwich, down the west shore of Narragansett Bay. They were Huguenots from Caude and had encountered much opposition before the Providence selectmen had allowed them to settle in the town. Unpopularity had dogged them in East Greenwich, whither they had come in 1686 after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and rumors said that the cause of dislike extended beyond mere racial and national prejudice, or the land disputes which involved other French settlers with the English in rivalries which not even Governor Andros could quell. But their ardent Protestantism, too ardent some whispered, and their evident distress when virtually driven from the village down by the bay, had moved the sympathy of the town fathers. Here the strangers had been granted a haven, and the swarthy Etienne Roulet, less apt at agriculture than at reading queer books and drawing queer diagrams, was given a clerical post in the warehouse at Pardon Tillinghast's wharf, far south in Town Street. There had, however, been a riot of some sort later on, perhaps 40 years later, after old Roulet's death, and no one seemed to hear of the family after that. For a century or more, it appeared, the Roulets had been well remembered and frequently discussed as vivid incidents in the quiet life of a New England seaport. Etienne's son Paul, a surly fellow whose erratic conduct had probably provoked the riot which wiped out the family, was particularly a source of speculation, and though Providence never shared the witchcraft panics of her Puritan neighbors, it was frequently intimated by old wives that his prayers were neither uttered at the proper time nor directed toward the proper object. All this had undoubtedly formed the basis of the legend known by old Maria Robbins. What relation it had to the French ravings of Roby Harris and other inhabitants of the Shunned House, imagination or future discovery alone could determine. I wondered how many of those who had known the legends realized the additional link with the terrible which my wide reading had given me. That ominous item in the annals of morbid horror which tells of the creature Jacques Roulet of Caude, who in 1598 was condemned to death as a demoniac, but afterwards saved from the stake by the Paris Parliament and shut in a madhouse. He had been found covered with blood and shreds of flesh in a wood, shortly after the killing and rending of a boy by a pair of wolves. One wolf was seen to lope away unhurt. Surely a pretty hearthside tale, with a queer significance as to the name and place, but I decided that the Providence gossips could not have generally known of it. Had they known, the coincidence of names would have brought some drastic and frightening action. Indeed, might not its limited whispering have precipitated the final riot which erased the Roulets from the town? You know, the one thing that I find peculiar or interesting is that when you look at H.P. Lovecraft, what kind of a man was he? Was he the kind of man who aspired to be a ship captain or a soldier or something like that? Or was he more the kind of man who was isolated and reading weird books and drawing weird diagrams? Compared to, if you compare H.P. Lovecraft to the Harrises versus the Roulets, where does he actually fall? He's probably got more in common with the Roulets than he does with the Harrises, really. Maybe he wants to consider himself like the Harrises, but the truth of the matter is he probably fits the Roulets a little bit better, and given his propensity for racism and ethnocentrism, I sense something about him through the families that he writes about in the Shunned House that must be really internally galling. On the one hand, Howard considers himself an erudite and aesthete New Englander with a proper English family, and yet his behavior is probably a lot more like the degenerate folk that he writes about. I think that's an interesting conflict, that Howard actually would probably fit in better with this degenerate, sorceress werewolf family as a person than he would with the proper, upstanding English types that he considers himself a part of. And I think that itself is kind of an interesting character dynamic that you could play with in a role-playing or narrative space. So I'm going to do one more series of readings for you in this episode, and it kind of goes off script in that we're not talking about the Shunned House anymore. But instead, we're talking about the man who wrote the Shunned House and the ideas and conceptions that would have been fed to him through his family structure that then led to him producing the Shunned House, among other works. And so, in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to read 3 short letters from H.P. Lovecraft's grandfather, Whipple Phillips, to a very young H.P. Lovecraft. For context, these letters were written between the years 1895 and 1899. So as Lovecraft is receiving them, he's between 5 and 9 years old. He's a small child, essentially, receiving short missives from his grandfather, who is out traveling in places like Indiana and Pennsylvania on various business ventures. Now, this is sort of a critical time for a young HPL in that during this span of years, his father, Winfield Lovecraft, is slowly wasting away from syphilis that he has contracted during the course of his affairs as a traveling salesman. And based on the commentary in W. Scott Poole's In the Mountains of Madness, as well as commentary from the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society's podcast Voluminous, which studies the letters of H.P. Lovecraft, it becomes clear that Whipple is aware that his grandson is without kind of a masculine influence, someone to raise him as a man. And so what you can see in a lot of these letters is efforts to, well, first of all, engage HPL in kind of manly pursuits, manly interests. Whipple is out in the wilderness, and he is adventuring, and he's earning money for the family. And when he talks about his experiences with HPL, he's always referencing animals that he sees, or kind of brief adventures or exciting moments that he has. And at the same time, he's also ending these letters with kind of admonitions for young Howard to buck up and be strong and be masculine in a traditional fashion. And I should mention these all come from H.P. Lovecraft Letters to Family and Family Friends, Volume 2, edited by S.T. Joshi and David E. Schultz from Hippocampus Press. Here's the first one. Office of O.Ye Land and Irrigation Company, W.V. Phillips, President and General Manager, A.J. Wiley, Chief Engineer. Eastern Office, 48 Custom House Street, Providence, Rhode Island. Grandview, Idaho, October 17th, 1895. Dear Skimper, I got a letter from you, Annie, and Grandmama, so I will write to all of you in this letter, for you can tell them all about it. I think your letter was very nice, and I was much pleased with your expression. It was out of sight. I and Mr. Wiley are running the gold machine and doing good work. The gold begins to show up on our burlap and in our concentrates. We are doing lots of work here now in every direction, but I hope I can get home about the 1st of November, and then we will have a real Gramp day. I went down the valley this morning, and I saw a big coyote. Dick was with me. My stars and garters, how Dick went for him. He has caught lots of them, and has lots of fights with badgers. I will tell you all about it when I get home. You and Dumplin' Mama must keep the barn shut every night, and take good care of Tell Aunt Annie and Grandmama to write again, and don't forget Aunt Lily. Kiss them all for me, and be a good skimper bee doodles. Gramp. So there are two things that I want to discuss immediately after this first letter. The first is my choice to bleep a portion of it. There's no actual slur in this letter, but there is potentially the name of an animal that could be a shortened slur. And as a result of knowing the family, knowing the history, and the values of that family that Howard inherited, I don't trust Whipple as far as I can throw him. So I'm electing to leave out that particular construction, which is likely the name of a horse. There are two family animals that are referenced in this letter. The first is Dick, who I interpret as a dog, although I can't really find any other references to him in letters prior. There's only one other letter prior in this particular collection, and it seems to reference a dog called Little Shorty. But suffice to say, Dick is likely either a dog or perhaps a horse, given where Whipple was, the time period, and what he was up to. The second animal, also likely a horse, given the reference to the barn and, again, the time period and the fact that automobiles wouldn't have been available as a form of conveyance. The Whipple Phillips family at this time was a wealthier family. Howard would have grown up with servants and the like. In that environment, his grandfather would have been encouraging him to take on some menial chores, closing up the barn at the end of the night and things like that, and perhaps some care and feeding of animal companions on the property. It isn't until we break into the 1900s that Whipple actually kind of starts to see his business ventures go south, and the servants get dismissed, and the family homestead kind of gets reduced down from there. But there's this clear sense that Whipple is trying to sort of instill in these final, in the final words of the missive, indicating, you have to be responsible, you have to be strong, you have to take care of things. There is a very strong kind of traditional masculine sense that the man of the house takes care of the household and the other members of the household. Let's look at the second letter now. Grand View, February 20th, 1899. Dear HPL, I have just written to Lily, and as I have a few moments to spare, I will tell you some of the things that have happened in the last few days. There was a man drowned in the Snake River 10 miles above us. Yesterday, a large band of horses swam across the river in front of our house. And today we had 3 big fish for dinner that we caught on the apron to the dam on the Brunel. We also started up the mining plant today. I saw a man out here that looked some like John Rathbone. Well, you see, he looked like your picture, and I imagined he had gotten straight away out here. You must look after things while I'm gone, and don't say a word about that fear. 10 shakes just the same. Gramp. I can't help but wonder what the fear that Whipple is referring to is all about here. Is there something that perhaps Howard has shared with him in a letter or postcard? Is there something that maybe his mother or one of his aunts might have related? We do know, specifically I'd be referencing the W. Scott Poole biography here, that Howard is, from an early age, having nightmares and kind of night terrors that will eventually coalesce into the night gaunt creature that makes its way into some of his Dreamlands writing later on. At the same time, this letter finds Howard in 1899 in February, so that is not long after the death of his father, who has suffered a 6-year decline involving psychotic episodes and being housed in an asylum as part of suffering the long-term deleterious effects of syphilis. And, I mean, even though I would expect on some level that Howard was kept away from the realities of his father's condition, there's no way that you don't know that a parent is suffering some sort of mental health breakdown. And there's no way that, you don't hear things and figure things out and maybe even have thoughts that you start to dream about because you don't fully understand them. I can certainly say that the mental decline of a parent is something that very strongly impacts a child. And I don't doubt that on some level Whipple would have noticed this and maybe started to be rather concerned for his grandson and the long-term effects on his grandson's health, especially his grandson's expression of masculinity, as Howard is effectively Whipple's heir apparent at this point. And that sort of thing was rather important. And again, 1899, Whipple is... things are starting to fall off for him, but he's maintaining all the same. He will eventually suffer a number of catastrophic business losses and succumb to a stroke as a result of, well, both ill health and possibly ill emotional health for having to reduce his family circumstances. So seeing Howard have fear, have kind of negative experiences surrounding his father's death, Whipple is presumably going to try and step in as much as he can and provide that sort of masculine role model for his grandson, because he needs his grandson to carry things on for him. There is, again, this idea, the Sophie Lewis notion, that the generations kind of affect each other back and forth in a linear fashion. So Whipple is putting upon Howard, and Howard's capacities are impacting how Whipple feels about the future and about his own mortality, perhaps. Let's have a look at a third letter. Hotel German, absolutely fireproof, F.S. Godfrey, Scranton, Pennsylvania, October 27th, 1899. Dear Punky, just 10 tonight. I have been to supper, and while I am waiting for Dr. Hill to call on me, I will drop you a line. Scranton is a fine place, and this hotel is the nicest I ever saw. Everything is perfect. Even the bill of fare is up to the Dolcatine Temple spread. I went to the theater last evening with Dr. Hill and his wife, and they are splendid. Well, how about the pears and all the matters at 454? You must look well to things in general, and learn the manly art so you can knock out some of them bad boys. With love to all, and 10 as above written. Yours truly, Gramp. P.S. I may be home next week for a few days. So this is the strongest call to action on the part of Whipple Phillips to HPL that I have available. And it certainly speaks to Whipple's need to see Howard buck up and be a bit more traditionally masculine. As far as taking care of the homestead, the number there being referenced, 454, is the number of the household. And then you have the encouragement that Howard take up the manly art to to start brawling with some of the local bad boys. Essentially encouragement for Howard to kind of throw himself into the local wolf pack of boys and see how he fares. Because that's young masculine socialization in 1899. Getting in a dust-up with your friends, or if not your friends, just the local boys in the neighborhood. In any event, it makes me wonder what Whipple Phillips might have been hearing while he was out dealing with his various business ventures. What were Howard's mother and aunts concerned about when they wrote to him that caused him to then enact these kinds of demands upon a young HPL? I hope these 3 letters make it clear that H.P. Lovecraft was not built out of a vacuum, and that he was a product of, among other things, familial context. And definitely if we look at his letters and we consider that there are literally thousands of pages of letters he wrote to family members, that definitely family was very key to him, very important to him. In many ways, it was one of his few touch points with reality. And so as he is writing stories like The Shunned House, he is living within the context of his own family narrative. And that family narrative is impacting how he sees the world, as well as how he interprets family within his stories, and brings us stories that connect families to cosmic horrors. Thank you for listening to the Delapore Media Podcast. You can find a variety of horror gaming resources at www.delapore.media. That's Delapore spelled Delapore. Delapore Media, toward verisimilitude in tabletop roleplay. Take care. This podcast is a production of the Delapore Media sole proprietorship. Its contents may not be used for AI training. Copyright 2026, all rights reserved.